charity partner, we've been the charity partner of Hogan Lovells for the last 4 years. And at the Wildlife Trust, we're enormously grateful for the huge support that Hogan Lovells have given us over that time. And they've opened up their office tonight to an audience part of this debate for wildlife tonight with a fantastic panel to discuss this enormously important topic around climate change, and actually to ask the question whether there are any reasons that we might be hopeful on climate action. We hope to find at least one or two before the evening's out. We've got a fantastic panel for you tonight. We have Jo Lewis, who's the relatively new Chief Executive of Wiltshire Wildlife Trust and was previously Policy Director at the Soil Association. We have Lord Deebden, who will be known to so many of you as the former chair of the Climate Change Committee, but also, of course, a very long-serving Environment Secretary of State in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet many years ago, and many other things besides. We have Rachel Solomon-Williams, who's Chief Executive of the Aldersgate Group, and I'll allow Rachel to tell you a little bit more later tonight about the Aldersgate Group. And we have Caroline Lucas, MP, of course, for Brighton Pavilion, and the one Green Party MP we have in Parliament. So, audience, please give a warm welcome to this superb panel. And we're recording this on Monday night, the last night or two, we will find out, of the COP28 talks taking place in Dubai. And although the Wildlife Trusts haven't gone to Dubai because we didn't want to get on a plane for this one, and we do go to a lot of international summits when we can go there by train, but we really think carefully about it before we go anywhere by plane, and we thought we weren't sure that it would necessarily add an awful lot to this one by going. Our Director of Climate and Evidence, Catherine Brown, has been following it very closely from here in the UK. Now, there's been a lot of attention on COP28 over the last week or so, but I want to turn attention to the situation here in the UK as well. And our first guest tonight, I'll turn to, is Jo Lewis, Chief Executive of the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. And Jo, just set the scene for us. Give us your brief reflection on where we are currently in the UK on what we should be trying to do is turn the tide on the climate and nature crisis.
Well, I think a good place to start is to perhaps answer the question some of you might be asking in your mind as to why is a chief exec of Wiltshire Wildlife Trust sitting on a panel to talk about global climate change. And I think there are two answers to that, really. The first is that the key test of all these global summits should be, do they stand us in better stead to accelerate genuine action on the ground? And the second, for me, Wiltshire is a farming county. Now, we're 80% of the land in Wiltshire is farmed. So it's incredibly important that food and farming are at the centre of action on climate and nature. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the stats, but food and farming is responsible for a third of emissions globally and 80% of biodiversity loss. So it's absolutely crucial that when we talk about stocktake in the UK and globally on nature and climate, that we are thinking through that food and farming lens. And so bringing it back to the UK, I think it is important. We are under the banner of reasons to be hopeful this evening. Quite challenging after that update from Catherine, but it is quite important to acknowledge that the direction of travel that this government and Michael Gove in particular has set us on around reform of farm payments is the right one, and that is something that could not have been taken for granted a few years ago. The challenge comes from the fact that the ambition seems to have been managed down. We don't have, at the moment, the budget attached to those farm payments for nature-friendly farming that matches the scale of need. So we urgently need to double the level of funding associated with that. And we also need to make sure that farmers can call on the advice of independent and well-trained advisors and not continue to rely on agronomists who are often in the pay of agrochemical companies. So an urgent need for access to independent advice. Crucially, we need to have more of a focus on nitrogen. And I think we're going to probably hear quite a lot this evening about carbon, about methane. There was hopes for the global methane pledge, but not many people focus on nitrogen and nitrous oxide emissions in particular. And nitrogen, I would say, and there is now a nitrogen collaboration of NGOs organising around this, is the key to tackling the climate and nature and public health crises in a joined-up way. Because the nitrous oxide emissions associated with excessive use of fertilisers, it is a long-lived gas, and it is something that it is a gas that needs to be brought down to near zero. It is also nitrogen, the source of pollution of our waterways, pollution of the air. A lot of very precious habitats are now suffering from nitrogen deposition, ancient woodlands and meadows that we have in Wiltshire. So that is an area that the government needs to urgently focus on. And I would say that the Climate Change Committee to date has shown brilliant leadership in a number of ways. I'm aware that Lord Deben will speak after I've spoken in a moment. One area in which I think it's important for the UK now to instruct the Climate Change Committee to revise perhaps its outlook and its advice is on its farming and land use pathway. Now, I think in the past the Climate Change Committee has felt constrained by its Climate Act mandate to just apply the climate lens when it comes to farming and land use. But we need urgently now to integrate, to optimise that pathway for biodiversity. That would mean significantly less focus on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, significantly more focus on cutting nitrogen use and achieving that carbon sequestration in soils and trees on farms.
Thank you, Jo. And just briefly, it'd be interesting to get your reflections of what we've seen from COP28 so far on this issue, because it was much talked about in advance of COP28 that actually food and farming would get a lot of attention at this COP. Has that proved to be the case?
Well, I mean, Catherine's update was not encouraging, was it? But we did see on day 2 of the COP a declaration, the Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action. It doesn't trip off the tongue quite like the Emirates Stadium, but it was, I think, it did feel like a breakthrough. It's now had more than 150 world leaders sign up to that, so that's 3/4 of the parties. And it is, in many aspects, an ambitious agenda that does talk about the importance to look at food systems in the round, look at them from the perspective of climate and nature and health, and really put farmers at the heart of this, because I think in our dependency, our global dependency on agri-chemicals. In fact, as we know from a fantastic report that the Wildlife Trust, before I arrived, I have to say, as part of the Wildlife Trust movement, produced a brilliant report called The Sweet Spot, which illustrated or evidenced very strongly that there is a lot of, with a high input, high output model that most farmers are dependent on, there is a challenge to profitability there. It's a treadmill that farmers are on. And there is a sweet spot for nature and climate and profitability and viability of farming livelihoods that we need to achieve. So that's the declaration, unfortunately, has not yet made its cut through to the global stock take text, which is what we need to see in order to ensure that all countries will be including food and farming in their national climate plans, which is absolutely essential if we are going to close the gap with Paris.
It's an issue that's certainly been very late to the climate game, it feels, in many respects, and certainly in terms of these international negotiations. And it's starting to be mentioned, but it's still pretty small compared to the scale of the issue. Lord Deben, what would you say that we can take from COP28 so far, and what does it mean then for us here in the UK?
Well, I always think it depends what points you look at things. Now, if I go back to 10, 11 years ago when I first became chairman of the Climate Change Committee, I'd never have thought then that we would have gone as far as we've done in those 10 or 11 years. Looking back, of course, I say to myself, we haven't gone anything like far enough. But it seems to me we have to keep those two thoughts in mind when we're talking now about biodiversity and nature-based solutions and the rest, because it's come, as you said, late to the whole programme. It's only, the first really big change was the Pope's encyclical, Laudato Si', when he made this very important point, which was that climate change was not the disease, it was the symptom of the disease. The disease was all those things that we'd done to the world, pollution of the seas, of the air, the way which we had removed the fertility of the soil, the damage that we'd done to the structure of the soil. And he has all those things together. And it seems to me that that was a crucial moment because people began to realize that you have to think of all these things together. Whereas I remember, you all remember, actually, even the young amongst you remember when climate change was one thing and the environment was another thing. As before that, aid agencies used to fight between the aid agencies looking after people and the aid agencies interested in the environment. And the environmentalists said that the others weren't interested in the environment, and the people said, well, you're not interested in the people. It's only now that they have understood that this is all part of the same problem, and they're fighting the same battles. So I'm encouraged by the fact that we are now seeing, horrible word, but it's the right word, a holistic approach to what we're trying to do. That is a huge change because it means that nobody can escape it in governments. And the fact that people have made this declaration and this number must be incredibly encouraging. The problem is always delivery. And for me, the thing that we get wrong in dealing with politics from an NGO point of view is that it's always true that delivery is the problem, not just on the environment, not just on climate change, not just on biodiversity. It's everything. Politicians are much better at policy than they are at delivery. And it doesn't matter what party they are, it's always the same. And I'm just noticing it, I think Caroline will say this. I mean, I now live in a council which is run by the Greens, but they're having exactly the same problem, the problem of actual delivery. When it comes to that, we're all in that problem. So for me, the issue now is how do we, as campaigners, get that delivery and help people to do it, which is why I keep on saying to people, don't just moan about this government, make it possible for whatever the next government is to do it, not just talk about it. So I'm very keen that this is the moment that we take encouragement to make them deliver. And that's why I'm pleased about what the government said. I mean, after all, nobody could be more critical of it than I over a whole range of things. But I just say I'm very pleased about Steve Barclay's statement. I think it really is build upon. You can build on it because it's got actual promises about actual things to be done, which can actually be measured. And as long as we really press and we do one other thing, which is the rule of all of us, which is that when they get it right, say thank you. Because you'll never get them to do the next things unless you just occasionally say thank you. So often there's nothing to say thank you about, but when there is, then say that, and then say, and because I've said thank you, I can now ask for the next thing, which seems to me to be where we should be now.
Let me then ask the next thing, which is, you could say that the Prime Minister, his concerns over delivery is what motivated him in September to say that the UK needs to take a more pragmatic approach, was the phrase he used, in delivering net zero. What did you make of that? And what message do you think that sent, say, to international negotiators ahead of COP28?
Well, you could say that, but it would be entirely untrue. I mean, the truth of the matter is that I think this was another of those problems of government, which is that there are a whole lot of special advisors who really have never grasped what these things mean, who clearly wrote that speech. I can't believe that anybody actually looked at it, because there was so much nonsense in it. Who's ever suggested that we should have 7 bins? The 7 deadly bins story is entirely untrue. Nobody's ever suggested we have a tax on meat. Nobody's ever suggested that we should force people to share cars. We have suggested that people should eat less meat, and we have suggested that where car sharing is possible, we should all try to encourage it. And we have suggested that we should divide our waste. And the Welsh, if I may say so, the Welsh government is doing extremely well on that front, if only the rest of the United Kingdom was actually doing as well. But it didn't seem to me to be hanged together, because then what was the announcement? It was that we put off the date at which it's not possible to sell anything but an EV or equivalent. Well, in total effect, that's not going to be a huge one, particularly as he's kept all the other dates, so that in fact it won't make all that difference. But what it does do is to undermine people's confidence in the government's word. Because in July, they said the date was immovable. In September, they moved it. Now, we've all seen this before, and it's also true of all governments. It was true of the coalition government. It was true of the Labour government. Governments have to understand that if you want people to rely on governments and to do what you want them to do, you must not change things, even if you think you've got a better idea. Even if this were a better idea, you still shouldn't change it. Because once people have fitted their businesses, their operations and everything else into that, if you undermine that one, it means that you can't get them to do it next time. So for me, it was pretty meaningless, because I don't see that it did anything on either side that was really serious. But it did undermine ourselves and our international position. Much worse internationally, of course, was the suggestion that we're going to license more oil and gas from the North Sea. And just in case anybody says to you, oh, well, it's very important, it's our oil, and you know, we would have to buy it from somewhere else anyway. Just remember 3 things. It isn't our oil, in the sense it will be sold at international price. So we don't get any cheaper. Second thing is, by the time this stuff comes out, we'll be awash with oil or awash. It's one or the other. It'll be either we've done things properly and we'll be okay, or we'll be underwater. So we just had better understand that. And the third thing is simply this, the figures. It was like bringing people home to figures. Practical. What was the word? Pragmatic. In 2050, if we stop any further expansion beyond the immediate gas because of what's happening in the Ukraine, if we stop that, then the North Sea oil production will have fallen by 95%. If we exploit it to its maximum, it will have, rather, it will have fallen by 97%. If we promote it to its maximum, it'll be 95%. So the tiny difference that it makes is a few hundred jobs. When you think of the thousands of jobs which renewables could have to replace that, you will see why it's a nonsense, just as the ridiculous coal mine in Cumbria is a nonsense. And we just have to recognise it's a nonsense which gives hope and comfort to the people who don't believe in climate change and who will use that as a means of saying, yeah, well, they don't really believe it. When push comes to shove, then they give way. And that's why it's so damaging.
Lord Deedman, thank you. Rachel Solomon-Williams, Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. First of all, do you want to just briefly introduce the Aldersgate Group?
Yes, thank you. The Aldersgate Group is a multi-stakeholder alliance, which is a mouthful, but what it means is we have about 70 large organisations in membership, including some of the UK's biggest businesses. So, for example, John Lewis, KPMG, Octopus Energy, you get the idea, alongside some wonderful NGOs, including the Wildlife Trusts, who are a member of the Aldersgate Group, and some non-profit organisations, including academic institutions, the Crown Estate, lots of different kinds of organisation, and we're fairly unique in that sense, I think. So we're not a trade association. We simply represent the position that we think action on the environment and on climate is absolutely fundamental to the business life in this country, and that it makes good business sense to take that action. So all our business members have demonstrated that they themselves are taking action, and they've passed our due diligence to become a member of the Aldersgate Group, and that's our message.
Thank you. So from your perspective, from your vantage point that you see, do you see reasons to be hopeful on this issue?
Looking at COP, it's a matter of record that there are 90,000 different people attending this year, and those people are from every kind of organisation, including all the biggest businesses that you can think of, and they're from every sector as well. I think if you'd looked at COP 10 years ago, it would have been from a much narrower range of sectors, particularly the energy sector, for example. And now we've got major businesses of all kinds, including law firms, for example, financial organisations, seeing this as a top priority for them. So whatever the outcome of the actual negotiation, which I will leave to the experts to discuss, I think that the presence of so many businesses in particular, and also civil society organisations, seeing this, and I think as Lord Deben said, it's really a systemic issue now, and everybody really understands that it is, and we need to think about not only nature and climate as one problem to be solved together, but also the different parts of that system, the food system, transport, energy, and all of those things as part of a total problem that we're working together on. I think we do have a reason to be cheerful because that is now much better understood. I also agree that the policy making is sort of going on for too long and we need to move into delivery, but that's a separate conversation.
Okay, and what do you see as sort of like the particular areas? Are there particular sectors where you see progress happening really fast at the moment, or other sectors where actually they seem to be moving quite slowly and they something needs to happen to speed things up?
I think it's really exciting what's happening in the financial sector. We have a number of financial sector organisations in membership at the Aldersgate Group, and they are very encouraging and excited about the disclosure requirements, for example. It's a sort of surprising thing to say that financial organisations are keen on additional regulation that requires them to disclose what they're up to, but actually it's incredibly useful because it shines a light on what's happening inside different other organisations and helps them to make business decisions. London is the global hub, I think, of financial carbon reporting, which is really exciting, and seeing that change happen very quickly over the last few years. We're now seeing a move from TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, into TNFD, the equivalent framework for nature, and the TNFD has been developed much, much faster than the TCFD was, based on that learning. So it's fantastic to see what's happening in the financial sector. Those organisations are now looking around for what to do with their money, and that's where the kind of challenge comes, because going back to that long-term certainty problem, we need to understand from the government what they see as the future for all the other kind of real economy sectors. So how is transport going to evolve? How is heavy industry in particular going to evolve? What does the government think that the future of the steel industry should be in this country? And it's really important that the government sets that out as clearly as possible and then puts in place a kind of delivery mechanism to make it happen. And that's what will bring then the finance into those sectors. And I think some of those real economy sectors are struggling at the moment to make the case for investment in the UK. And that's not a lack of interest by them, it's a lack of being able to attract investors to their proposition because they can't demonstrate what the long-term outlook is.
And are you starting to see sort of even fractions in the business community? You know, some businesses want to go a lot faster, and of course you still have dinosaur bits of the business community holding back. Do you start to see real tensions coming out across the wider business community on this agenda?
I think in the UK we're lucky to have a very progressive business community in general, more so than in some other parts of the world. I think if you look at the US, it's more polarised into those who are pushing forward advanced technologies and those who are very much kind of sitting on the other side of the fence to almost to the level of climate denial. I don't think that climate denial is something you'll hear in a boardroom in this country. It's more a question of how fast can we go? Can we afford to kind of take that leap in terms of investment? Where's that balance between short-term security and long-term outlook? So There is, of course, a spectrum in the business community in this country, but I think we're really lucky that we've got a very clear kind of leadership approach. It's not the case everywhere in the world.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be looking forward to your answers when we come to the Q&A. I'll come to Caroline Lucas now. There were, well, I don't know. I think there might be. Caroline, I'd love to actually pick up with you, in particular the relationship between these big international agreements and what happens at the big international COPs and what needs to happen domestically, and to what extent that plays down into domestic politics and to what extent the domestic politics plays back up into the international. What's your perspective as you've observed that over many years?
Well, I think both of those things are true. Certainly, I think governments don't have so much credibility on the international stage if they haven't got their own house in order. And I think that's actually what was one of the most damaging things about the rollback that Rishi Sunak announced in September. As Lord Deben said, there wasn't that much, although we could perhaps talk at some point about rented accommodation and what was rolled back there when it came to the requirement for landlords to properly insulate their properties. But other than that one, the changes around boilers and cars were not that significant in themselves, but the message it sent, I think, was massively unhelpful. So right now, especially when we know that tonight, there are these big debates going to go on around, the fact that phase out and phase down aren't in the text at all. And I do worry that the UK has actually shot itself in the foot slightly, because normally we've had a role of global leader, but at a time when, as Lord Deben said, we've just given the green light to a coal mine and to 100 new oil and gas licenses and to the largest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea, we're not in the best position to say to some other countries, excuse me, would you mind agreeing to phase out fossil fuels? So it matters, and I think we shouldn't ever underestimate the fact that other countries do notice what we're doing. It really does matter. And the other way around too. I mean, I think it is important that when you've got commitments that are made at these global summits, that does give you greater leverage to try to ensure that your government then falls into line and meets them. It gives you another way of trying to hold them accountable, I guess.
Do you see things that give you hope? I mean, you'll be aware, as all of us, around this whole kind of climate debate, there's so many things that are cause of massive concern. But what's given you real hope over the last few years?
I wanted to answer that in two ways, actually. First of all, I wanted to make a distinction that a rather wonderful writer, Rebecca Solnit, a US writer. If you don't know her work, I warmly commend it. And she talks really interestingly about the difference between optimism and hope. And for her, optimism is sort of, that kind of feeling that you're sitting on a sofa clutching your lottery ticket, just being optimistic that it's going to happen, but you're actually not doing anything to make it happen. And she contrasts that with hope. And she says that hope is something that you break down doors with in an emergency. It's something that gets you out there because you believe that something better can happen. There's no guarantee that it will, but you know that your actions will be part of that and can actually lead to a better outcome. And that kind of hope I certainly have. And I would find it, I guess, in the fact that, well, the economics of all of this is shifting us in the right direction. I mean, never mind the politics. The economics is such that renewables now are so much cheaper and faster and more effective than fossil fuels. And I think there's a really exciting story to be told about that. I would say young people make me hopeful, but I'm really also very aware that it's not fair to keep landing that on their shoulders as if they have to be the ones to make the rest of us hopeful after we've, frankly, made pretty much a mess of their futures. So although it is exciting to see Fridays for Future and young people really being engaged with this debate, I'm also very worried that it shouldn't be them skipping classes that is what gets us feeling hopeful and focuses minds. So I'm grateful that they do it, but they shouldn't have to do it.
And just before I go to Q&A to ask you for your questions tonight, just to pick up on it from all the panelists, that you talked about the changes in the economics around this, and you could say also around technology. There's something very exciting, isn't there, about how once we get over the real hump of this, we might actually see that change happens far faster than we ever predicted.
I just want to say one thing, which is that is true. And, you can look at all of the really positive stuff that's happening around renewable energy in particular, but that is as nothing if it doesn't actually substitute for the fossil fuels. If it's alongside the fossil fuels, that doesn't help us. I don't know if anyone saw George Monbiot on Question Time the other week, but he put it beautifully, saying that, the fact that you've had a salad doesn't take away from the fact that if you've just had two enormous great buns, that doesn't help the fact that you're trying to lose weight, right? So the salad has to substitute for the buns in that analogy, and here, the renewables and efficiency and all of that have to substitute for the fossil fuels. They've got to stay in the ground. And the bit that worries me is that while we're so busy measuring how much progress is being made on renewables, rightly so, it's got to be as a replacement.
We've got to stop eating the buns.
Buns have got to go.
Yeah. Lord Debian, do you want to say something on this? I know it's something you've talked quite a lot about in the past.
Well, first of all, I entirely agree with that definition of hope. It isn't optimism. It's a mixture of determination that we're going to do something about it, and the fact that we're not going to be depressed into inaction. I mean, I think the danger always is, I find this, have always found this, is the biggest difficulty is you have to tell people the truth, which is that we are in a desperate position. We could destroy the means of life on Earth. We have that in our hands. Our overweening power as human beings have that. But that must not lead you to say, well, let's eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. If you've actually got to see that as a challenge, and once you see it as a challenge, then there is that real hope. I also think that the business community, the finance community, and the farming community. I mean, we're talking about farming. The number, when I started to farm, which is not all that long ago, but there were only 2 red pole cattle herds in our area, which was the traditional kind of animal. Now there are 12 or 13. And these are arable farmers who believe you should move to mixed farming and are talking about regenerative farming, and the whole of this is changing. And when we set up a little group, a cluster for farmers, my goodness, some of those people who came through the door, you wouldn't have believed they would have thought, because they would tease me 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because I've always taken the view that organic farming is something that really matters. They're now beginning to say, very importantly, we can't go on like we are going on. Now, all that is very, very hopeful, and I think that the terms of trade, so to speak, are swinging against the fossil fuel and the old-fashioned ways of doing it, but not fast enough. That's why we have to press and push. I think that Caroline was right. We have to bang down those doors and just say, we haven't got time to wait for you to be converted by your bank balances. We've got to get there quicker.
Thank you. Jo, you look very keen to come in on this.
Well, I was just, again, yes, we were talking about the economics, and I think, there was a huge wake-up call for the farming community when fertilizer prices went up 300% in the space of 12 months. That really did prompt, it opened a door, because it's incredibly important. There have always been believers that, there were the incredible organic pioneers who, against the odds, they decided that they were going to take responsibility for farming in a way that works for nature and the climate. It was a heroic and very challenging thing to do, because if you haven't got the polluter pays, if you haven't got any public money for public goods, then you're taking all the costs on yourself as a farmer, of saying we're not going to pollute. Even though there's no level playing field for us, everyone else is pushing their costs onto the environment and onto people's health. We're not going to do that. We're going to internalize those costs, and having to make that pay in the market with a premium that people then turn back and punish them for, as if it was just some self-interested approach. And so I think it's really, really important that we stand up for the organic pioneers and we learn from them now. But we are in a situation, a different context now, where finally government has woken up to, we need to have farm payments that are public money for public goods. And then, we haven't got the polluter pays yet, but we do have, we have seen that impact on fertilizer prices. And it really is meaning that we're starting to see the emergence of a really meaningful incentive framework for farmers to make this transition, because a lot of farmers want to make this transition, but they can't do it if it doesn't represent a viable and resilient livelihood. So one thing we have to get right on top of the farm payment reform is making sure there's meaningful access for farmers of all scales to private markets for environmental services. And that, again, is an area where the government scored a big own goal with nearly ripping up nutrient neutrality. And we were worried that the King's speech would signal the arrival of a nutrients bill to get it in there through the back door. They've come back from the brink on that one, but immediately questions being asked around, can we really invest in markets around biodiversity net gain and the whole package, which is absolutely crucial to give that meaningful incentive framework for farmers and landowners to make those changes.
Thank you. I might just come back to nutrient neutrality a bit later on, just for a bit of fun, really. But let's go out for some questions right now. Gentleman here.
How can we as citizens...
Can you just wait for the mic to come to you?
So, my name is Will. I'm from Just Stop Oil, and I'm wondering, how can we as citizens hold the government to account and get them to be leaders on reducing carbon emissions again? Is it time for civil disobedience? Is it time for direct action?
Thank you. Caroline, shall I go to you first on that? You've said a thing or two on this in the past.
Well, I think we need to use just about every non-violent means that we can to try to make sure governments act and are held accountable. And so I don't have any problem with peaceful direct action. And as someone who was arrested, and I should add acquitted, for demonstrating outside the fracking site in Bolcombe some years back, because fracking to me was the front line of the climate agenda just then, I think there is a role for peaceful direct action. But there are plenty of people who don't want to do that, in which case, I would love them to be as active as they possibly can be in whatever organisations or employment site that they're in, and make sure that this is something that is so mainstream that their organisations, their unions are putting pressure on their MPs and so forth, because it's got to be something that is really bottom up and right across the board. It can't just be certain sections of society doing this stuff. And I would say as well that, sometimes there are all sorts of things, aren't there, where you sign up to write to your MP, 38 Degrees or any number of these organisations. But they do make a difference. Even better if you can write something that is your own rather than something that is very obviously written by a third-party organisation. But MPs do take notice, particularly MPs in more marginal seats. And even better if you can actually go and beard them in their constituency office and eyeball them, because they are your representative, and that your vote is dependent on what they decide to do. So I think don't ever underestimate the amount of power that you can have, and really try to leverage it in every kind of possible way you can.
Lord Diedemann, is it worth writing to peers as well?
Well, it's always worth writing, but I think, first of all, you don't just write to your local MP, you get an appointment. And if they ask you what it's for, you say it's a private matter between me and the MP, and you go. And you go and you talk about the constituency itself. You bother to find out where the flooding is taking place. You bother to do that. And that means that you begin to bring home... Members of Parliament are much more interested in what their constituents say than anybody else, so one does that. And there are no marginal seats at the moment, they're all marginal. So everybody, and they're all terrified, so out you go and you give them what for. And you make sure that, and you also go to the candidates. And don't think that all parties stick to what their party policies are. There are many members of Parliament who are pretty wet on all these matters right across the piece. So you want to find out about the Member of Parliament. You'll soon be able to do it, because I'm just starting with my Labour, Liberal and Welsh Nationalist friends website, you'll be able to look up the new constituency and see what each of the candidates actually think about climate change. So you'll be able then to start lobbying them in a very direct way. But the second thing is, we've got to be much more intelligent about this. For example, if you want to have, I had a long conversation with two sisters, which are the biggest supplier of chickens and other things.
To be clear, that the company is called Two Sisters.
Yes.
It's not that you just...
That's quite right. But I'm only just saying, the man who owns that, and it is a privately owned company, has decided that his first duty is to do something about climate.
And this is a food company, isn't it?
It's a food company. So you look at what they're doing and you look at other people and you make those choices. The other thing is we make choices. We must look at everything through the lens of climate change. What do we do ourselves? What does the golf club we belong to, or the church, or whatever else it is, what do they do, and how can we change that? And then what does our local council do, our parish council, district council, county council, and then what can we bring to the Member of Parliament? We cannot complain about people not doing things if we don't use the techniques that we've got.
Great, thank you very much. Just next question, yeah, lady here. Second row, just wait for the mic to come to you, please.
Thank you so much. It's been a fabulous panel discussion. My name's Lizzie Crotty and I work with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, based here in the UK permanently. My question is, we've heard a lot about quite localised issues, and we're talking about localised nature and biodiversity and even climate. My question is about basically a huge percentage of the world's biodiversity being in a lot of other places in the world and in a lot of developing countries. So is there much appetite, thinking about what you were saying, Rachel, from businesses to actually invest in some of those areas that have a disproportionate amount of the world's biodiversity that's very quickly disappearing?
Yeah, so Rachel, how about that?
That's a really interesting and complicated question, because the answer depends on where in the world and how the incentive structures are set up around that. And I think it's a really evolving market at the moment. So international nature markets are probably the favourite topic of conversation for conferences that are being planned in 2024. Everybody's trying to work out how to get the money to where the problem is, and how to turn that into an opportunity from a business point of view. And in some cases it's kind of obvious how that might work, and in other cases not so much. They need to be really careful that, so businesses are very worried about being accused of greenwashing, for good reason, because they have been accused of greenwashing, but it needs to not look as though they're spending the money to create an offset, if that offset would then be challenged in terms of its integrity. So I think it's a really important live conversation now about how we help to generate a kind of value around those natural systems in other parts of the world. There is certainly interest from the business community to get into that space if they possibly can, and it has begun, but I think it's early days at the moment, and it'll be really exciting to see where that might go in the next few years.
So Joe, should British-based business invest in restoring nature here in the UK, perhaps even in Wiltshire, or abroad?
Or abroad. Well, I think my first response on hearing that question was thinking about all the ways in which the actions of businesses in the UK and supply chains in the UK are driving those impacts offshore, and particularly, obviously, the import of animal feed for industrial livestock in the UK. So there is, I think, an area larger than Greater London that is currently dedicated to producing soy for just the livestock, industrial livestock, so chicken and pigs and dairy in this country. And so it's incredibly important. Hearing about Two Sisters, again, my question might be, how do they reconcile their business model with where we need to get to as a country, which is halving our consumption of industrial chicken, at the very least.
Let me just show you why I think this is important. They are working now on a substitute for soya. Their whole aim is that they will remove soya from the whole system. So they are actually aiming at the right thing. They haven't got there yet, but they're well on the way. And that's what we need is, if I may say so, action and delivery.
Well, that's, then let's hope they're also thinking about tackling the pollution of rivers and all, it's a whole nexus of horror stories at the moment, industrial chicken, but that does sound like it is a meaningful step forward. But then clearly, we hope that businesses will also be looking to invest in their own supply chains domestically. So, I wouldn't want to have the food companies, food retailers, food manufacturers, for instance, just focusing on perhaps the more easily marketable projects overseas that can be invested in, but not taking the opportunity to pay their own supply chains, their own farmers, at the level that's needed in order for those farmers to farm in a sustainable way. I think, my nervousness is always that, in the past, I think the focus and the investment has gone to approaches which are around creating habitat in the margins, and then in the middle of the field, the farming continues intensive as ever, and we can't continue to put a fence around nature and pretend that we can carry on farming in the same way. So really keen that it's not just ESG commitments and offshore offsets, but it is actually about reforming supply chains in this country. And hopefully that will reach the farmers of Wiltshire.
Joe, thank you. Next question, please. Lady here by the pillar.
Thank you. Hannah from Russia, UK. I wonder, we've had some interesting news recently about the right to roam and a kind of a rollback on that. And I wonder just kind of if you could comment on access to green space and kind of maybe some of the opportunities, the risks, the ways that we as charities, NGOs and citizens can be kind of talking to farmers, business leaders and politicians about greater access to land and to nature and to kind of equality of access to green space in the UK.
Caroline, you've done a fair bit on right to roam. Do you want to say a bit on this, and then I might come back to Joe?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because I put down a private members bill exactly trying to expand the right to roam and looking in particular at how it works in Scotland, where they have an assumption, a presumption that you've got a right to roam unless there are good reasons why not, and there are some good reasons why not, if there are ground nesting birds or if there are animals in a particular field where you would go through it when they were lambing or whatever else. There are times, obviously, in places where you wouldn't want to roam. But I think we could be expanding massively what we have in England and Wales just now. At the moment, despite the Crow Act, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act of, when was it, 20 years ago, we have, I think, the right to roam legally on just 8% of English land and 3% of rivers. So that really could increase and should increase, I think. And one of the reasons I say that is because I genuinely believe something that another amazing writer, Richard Louv, says in his book, Last Child in the Wood. And he says, we won't protect what we don't love and we won't love what we don't know. And that sense of knowing it in a really kind of intimate way, not just knowing it from a footpath, although footpaths are hugely important, and one real consideration is making sure that the right to roam doesn't mean that those footpaths aren't upheld. And so I think, in the coalition of organisations who are now talking about how we could expand the right to roam, there's a real awareness that we need to make sure that's not at the price of letting money come away from investing in those footpaths. But having said that, really feeling at home in your environment and loving it and knowing it and feeling that kind of comfort and intimacy with it, it feels to me that is so important in terms of equipping people then to be able to fight more effectively for it. And at a time, there's that famous example, wasn't there, Craig, of, was it the Collins Dictionary or the Oxford Dictionary, one of those children's dictionaries anyway, some years ago, taking out words like bluebell and conker and replacing them with chat room and bot. That really did worry me. And I think there are serious mental health concerns too, because we know and we saw through the COVID pandemic just how important access to nature is for our own mental as well as physical well-being. So there are just so many win-wins here. And it wouldn't be an expensive thing to do. And I think we could get farmers on side. I think we can learn from what happened in Scotland. There was a really painstaking engagement with farmers over time, and recognising, just the final point, that the right to roam also brings responsibilities, obviously. And there is a sort of Countryside Act, but hardly, not act, what do you call it? Code of, sorry, I'm so tired.
Yeah, Countryside Code.
Yeah, Countryside Code, that. There is that, and the government spent some time updating it quite recently, but no one still knows about it, So we need to do far more in schools and so forth so that people understand what their responsibilities are as well as their rights.
Great. And Joe, from your perspective, from Wildlife Trust perspective, obviously it's a tricky thing in one sense that we absolutely exist to try and promote, people getting close to nature, but we've also got to protect nature. What's your perspective on this?
Well, actually, we've, in Wiltshire, had the opportunity, I've only been in this role for 4 months, and in my second month I got to open a new nature reserve, which also had a new nature park, so at Bay Meadows, which is a lovely reserve. We're very lucky to have funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and we were able to acquire an area at threat of development with a beautiful chalk stream running through. Vital corridor for otters and water voles and brown trout, and the water team, Wiltshire Wildlife Trust has a dedicated water team. We've been busy re-meandering, but it again was an option to us to be able to create a really dedicated space, a nature park for families to be able to, yes, walk the dog, have access to the river, to paddle so the children could take their shoes off and, actually get the little fishing nets in and catch the minnows and all those things that, if we're honest, if we were trying to tiptoe around nature, we wouldn't necessarily have had the formative experiences as children, which make us love it. So we do need to have that opportunity, make sure that people can, starting from where they are, experience nature in a way that moves them. But also there are some sensitive species and some areas that need to be protected. So that was the ideal. I do think it's really important that we keep alive one of the more meaningful and tangible goals from the Environmental Improvement Plan that the government launched, which was for everyone to live within 15 minutes walking distance from natural green space. So coming back to the question around, what should you was it beard your prospective parliamentary candidate with? I love that expression. So what's the challenge you put out to prospective parliamentary candidates, to MPs, and really saying, well, how are you going to bring that about? How are you in this county, in this constituency, going to help make that a reality? Because it really is only when we start to achieve that and give every child growing up the opportunity to experience the joy of nature that we will actually help to make sure that we're sustaining this action going forwards.
Yeah, incredibly important. Next question, please. Gentleman there.
Hello, Stuart Dainton. I work for the National Forest. I just would like to pick up on the point of hope that Lord Deben gave about the environmental sector working together now with people, health, etc. How now do we then join forces to win the war? If we were fighting the battle, how do we win the war? And is it now time for Cobra?
Lord Deben, do you want to pick that one up?
It's quite difficult for me to refuse to pick it up, as well, first of all, I do think we have to talk amongst each other better and work together better. And the change in the National Forest, if I may say so, and the change in forestry generally has been enormous. I mean, I remember when they were the enemy. I mean, you couldn't get anybody to deal with it was really difficult because there was a failure to understand that forestry was a crucial part of what we were trying to do, and we needed a forestry industry as well as forest open to people, and we needed choices that had to be made. The invention of the National Forest was, I think, a huge breakthrough. It had something to do with it. I'm very keen indeed that we should do that. And so everybody has got to work together, and the one way which we are siloed in this country in lots of ways, and we really ought to try to be much closer to each other. And I think the other thing is that we've got to recognise the small things as well as the big things. I was so pleased that you mentioned the whole issue of being within a quarter of an hour of a wild place. Too often we think of the countryside as what we're talking about. The Victorians got it right with their parks. I mean, if you look at London, London is a wonderful city, partly, perhaps overwhelmingly, because of the parks and the Clapham Common and all these other places which are alive with wildlife. We've got to do more of that, but it's the small things. And when we talk about trees, it's not just the National Forest, it's ensuring that we have more trees in our streets, More trees in our gardens, less concrete and a few trees make all the difference. Fewer insurance people believing that anywhere you put a tree is bound to undermine the house, which is absolute nonsense, but they will do that. Have a real go. We've just got to be better at thinking small as well as thinking big and working together to do it.
Rachel, Aldersgate Group, very much a model of different sectors working together.
We are. I hope we've been leading the way. So the Aldersgate Group's been running for 15 years, and I think at the beginning of that period, it was quite unusual to have this combination of different sectors all sitting in a room together, trying to problem solve together. Now we find we're kind of very much in demand, and everybody wants to think in this way. I think having also sat thinking about it from this point of view, there's a top-down way of solving it and a bottom-up way. The top-down way is we would love to see some much clearer cross-cutting strategies. So this is easy to say and hard to do. But for example, what about a land use strategy for this country, which actually thinks about both agriculture and biodiversity and housing and all the other ways that we want to use the land? Could we think about that in one go? What about the planning system, which fits alongside that? How do we think about the priorities for that? What about an industrial strategy that says, here's what the future of our industries will look like as a whole and the way we want those to come together? Those are things that our members want to see in order that that will then filter down to policies that fit together and are kind of complementary to each other. I would just say that the bottom-up piece is very much to do with skills and education as well. I've got an 8-year-old daughter, and when she gets to be 15 and she's thinking about her future options, I don't want her to have a really boring conversation with a careers advisor that says, which GCSEs are you going to choose? Well, that's a bit early, isn't it? But anyway, and which A-levels are you going to choose and which university would you like to go to? She should be understanding that the world is much more rich than that, and that there's a whole kind of range of different paths available in life which will help to create the world that we want to see. And we need to kind of grow our education and skills sectors enormously so that they can feed these future strategies that don't exist yet.
Thank you. You've reminded me, when I was 14, I went to a careers teacher and they said, what do you want to be? And I said, an environmental campaigner. And they, on their BBC B computer from the 1980s at the time, they didn't have that. So he typed in the code for being a careers teacher and told me that's what you need to do, become a careers teacher. And I ignored it, of course. Next question, please. Yeah, gentleman has been waiting here, sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Hi there, Liam McAleese, Esme Fairbairn Foundation. There's conversation at COP about adapting to dangerous climate change that we're already seeing, and we know that is impacting vulnerable communities now, both globally, but also increasingly in the UK. And I'd just be interested in the panel's comments on the extent to which we're ready for this in the UK now. Thank you.
Lord Deedham, as the former chair of the Climate Change Committee, which obviously had a remit obviously around climate adaptation as well, are we ready?
No, not at all. And the 5-year plan for resilience, which the government has to produce, surprisingly enough, every 5 years, was a very, very disappointing document. We had produced a list of things that needed to be done beforehand, and they didn't meet a whole range of these things, and in total certainly didn't meet that. I think we have to recognise how bad that is. I just take my own village. We've never been flooded as we have been flooded this about a month ago. Houses which will now be uninhabitable for a year. Never considered that they were in the floodplain or that happened. The River Deben was always thought to be a rather nice river. I'm afraid it's a rather unpopular river at the moment because it's flooded all those homes, and we had people staying with us because we're just slightly higher land. And my daughter's house was the first one that wasn't flooded. It just came literally lapped up on the edges. Never conceived of this happening. I only use this example because this is going to happen more and more. People will find things happening which they've never thought of because of the effect of the weather here. I think the big problem is that people have thought of climate change as something that's going to happen, and it's likely to happen somewhere else. And what is now happening is, and that's why I don't like talking about doing things for one's children and grandchildren. We should be doing things for us. Even at my age, this is happening here, now, to us. And if you want to help other people adapt, we've got to show them that we are adapting. And everything we do, we come back to the point about looking at everything through the lens of climate change. Everything we do, every new block of houses that we build, everything that we think about and plan, all the infrastructure, all that, we have to do thinking about a situation in which we will have more storms, more rain, more drought, and more heat than we've ever experienced before. And in those cases, we either prepare right across the board and at the same time repair right across the board, or we're not going to be ready, and we certainly aren't.
Thank you. Joe, there's a particular role, of course, that nature can play in helping us adapt to climate change.
Yes, so the question made me immediately reflect on how we've neglected the soil. And I think that if you looked at, we're lucky enough to have a director of climate change who used to head up adaptation at the Climate Change Committee, and the recommendations on adaptation and resilience. Soil health was always, up there as a priority that needed to be recognised. And then over on the other side, for climate mitigation, soil carbon was in the mix, but there was always this sort of, we get ourselves in a bind about we can't measure it yet, so therefore, maybe it's reversible, and so we can't put all our eggs in the basket of soil carbon. But if we brought mitigation and adaptation together, then soil would have been absolutely number one on the list, but we never did. Hopefully we're going to get there now. But I think, Also, there's a huge opportunity for wetland creation, which to be supported through the reform of farm payments, but also through private finance. I had the opportunity to go and see a fantastic farmer called Richard Allen in Wiltshire, who is one of the first cohort of farmers who've been involved in the Bristol Avon catchment market, which Wiltshire Wildlife Trust and Avon Wildlife Trust have led on with N-Trade. And he was waxing lyrical about how the opportunity to access biodiversity net gain through that marketplace has enabled him to turn on its head what his father always told him, which was, we've got to get the water off this land as quickly as possible. And now he's saying, we've got to hold the water on the land as much as possible. And he's a big fan of beavers. Anyway, so but really inspiring to see these fabulous wetlands that he's been able to create on his farm as a result of being able to access that private finance as well, alongside countryside stewardship. So big opportunity to be holding that water, and obviously then that is by far the most cost-effective way to be tackling flooding.
A lot of people don't realise, don't they, that actually the more carbon you put in the soil, the more that soil holds water.
It makes it spongy, yeah. So, I mean, exactly, yes, you're right, thank you for the prompt. So, by neglecting the soil, I mean, what we've tended to do is we've tended to, because we can rely on bagged nitrogen, it's like sugar. Bagged nitrogen, you're growing things in a chemical substrate, quick fix for the plant, and you don't therefore need to invest in the soil. So as a result, all the complex crop rotations which you used to return organic matter to the soil, you don't need them anymore. So the soil is degraded, which means that the organic matter is what holds the carbon. It also makes the soil spongy. It makes it absorb water and hold it really effectively. So it is the secret to making sure that your crops do much better in a drought. They tend to also have to work a little bit harder without the fertilizer, so the roots go deeper. So much more resilience from soil that has been managed to maximize soil carbon, but also just to have to cope without nitrogen fertilizer.
We will come back to nitrogen fertiliser very shortly. We've got time for just a couple more questions. There's a gentleman, well, maybe I'll do three. A gentleman here, just very quickly, if we can.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to sorry, my name's Johnny Hughes. I think I'm here representing the Postcode Earth Trust tonight.
That's part of the People's Postcode Lottery.
Yeah, part of the People's Postcode Lottery, thank you, Craig. I just wanted to come back to the COP, actually, and multilateralism as a mechanism for tackling climate change. In some ways, it's absolutely incredible, remarkable that 180 plus countries come together in a, now every year to discuss the future of the planet and how they can cooperate. But in some ways, it's an incredibly difficult and clunky mechanism, and sometimes a race to the bottom, as we've seen with some of the text that's not been very successfully negotiated. And I always ponder how we could speed things up and maybe have something alongside these incredible COPs. I think the ray of hope this year actually has been the EU deforestation regulation. That is, in a sense, a regional bloc, the European Union passing a law which could be transformational if it's implemented properly. So I'd like the panel's top, let's say two international mechanisms, and I'm thinking particularly about sustainable trade policies here, but there may be others which could sit alongside these international negotiations, which would really, really drive systemic change. I know that's a big question.
I'll come to the panel, ask them one each, please, because we're running out of time.
Thanks.
So each panel member, one thing that you think can speed things up outside of COPs, could be international mechanisms or maybe not even international mechanisms. Caroline?
Well, you touched on it yourself, I think, when you talked about trade agreements, because at the moment you've got this incredibly laborious, slow and ultimately unenforceable process that happens under the COP. And then meanwhile, you've got all of these free trade agreements that are being signed up to, which do have enforcement mechanisms that do mean that you can get fined if you don't actually deliver on them. And so we need to make sure that in those trade agreements, we're properly building in all of the environmental concerns and regulations and all of the rest of it. So in fact, rather than having the trade agreement undermining the COP process, it's actually something that can help you enforce it. And if there was one quick treaty, if I could just cheat slightly, that we need to, get away from right now, because sometimes these enforceable treaties are doing the wrong thing, then that treaty that basically, I'm so tired, what's it called, Craig? This treaty, the one that means that you can't extract yourself from oil. You can't say to an oil company that you don't want them to be there in your country anymore, and they can sue you as a result.
Yes, the foreign direct liability stuff, you mean? No, you mean something else?
No, I mean something else, and I can't...
Alien tort, no.
No, it's it's a really well-known treaty that everyone's talking just now, and we're trying. And many
non-proliferation.
No. And some EU countries.
Fossil fuel non-proliferation. No.
Some EU countries have already got out of it, and we need to speed up getting out of it. Otherwise, if we say to a fossil fuel company, "We don't want you to,"
oh yes.
Sorry. Anyway,
yes.
It stops you from doing it, and we need to stop that thing.
That one. Okay, thank you. Rachel.
You got it now.
I know.
Carbon pricing, both at sectoral level and at regional level. I know that carbon pricing's had a dicey history, but if you look at, for example, CORSIA in the aviation sector, it's gone very, very slowly, but it is gradually ramping up. And it does have understanding from the aviation sector that they are going to have to change. It needs pushing harder, and maritime is even further behind CORSIA, so it's not working quite yet, but it's gradually getting there, and it's working faster than the overall UNFCCC process. The same is true of regional level carbon pricing. So the EU ETS actually has teeth now. It's taken 15 years, but it works. And those things can work. And in parts of America as well, we've seen carbon pricing be effective. So I would say global agreements on everything are more or less impossible. But if you can break it down a bit and apply a price, that's the best way to drive change.
Thank you. Lord Deebden.
Nationally, put into the Planning Acts that no planning permission may be given without taking climate change into account. And internationally, getting much closer back to our relationship with the European Union. It was a scandal that we left. It's done a huge amount of damage, and we need to work with them as closely as we possibly can.
Thank you. And Joe?
Well, perils of being the last in the queue this time, because I would have definitely measured on trade deals. So instead I'll say extending, so the initiatives that there are internationally around sustainable soy, they need to be extended to across all sustainable commodities. And when it comes to, inevitably going to be coming back to soy and what represents progress on soy. But soy, the whole agenda around soy has been around trying to cut out deforestation. But a huge area, as I said, of Brazil is devoted to growing soy for industrial livestock, and the pesticide use associated with that is mind-boggling. The pesticide use in Brazil has gone up 900%, and it's all associated with producing this soy. So we need to make sure that the action on soy is also looking at the pesticides used associated, phasing out hazardous pesticides as well. Pesticides which are banned in the EU and the UK are being used on the soy, which is then imported to feed chicken that we eat in the UK. So action to try and stamp that one out.
Okay.
Could I quickly just say Energy Charter Treaty? It was just
yes.
giving me so much pain. I had to Google it, but I've found it. And the Energy Charter Treaty allows fossil fuel companies to sue governments if governments try to break the contract they've got with them.
Yes. I'm embarrassed to admit, Caroline, I was checking timings when you were talking. You asked me as well. But anyways, that's why I didn't quite get it. We've got time for 2 more questions. Yeah. Just there at the back, please. And then I'll come to this lady here.
Right.
As brief as you can, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Aaron Matthew, Youth Forum for the Wildlife Trust, BCN. Both Lord Deben and Ms. Caroline Lucas mentioned climate action not resting on the shoulders of a younger generation. So do you guys believe that there's been a uniform approach or becoming a uniform approach multi-generationally to climate action?
You want to take that?
I'm not sure I entirely understood the question. So is the question, is there already a multi-generational approach to climate?
Is there already, or are there?
I mean, I don't think there is, and I think there needs to be. Right. And I think we need to make sure that it doesn't become a real kind of fault line in terms of intergenerational anger. I mean, I would have absolutely huge sympathy with young people who feel really furious with the old generation, because we haven't left this place in a decent state for you. And if I can just have one idea of a policy that could make a difference, albeit I know Lord Deben was just counselling us against thinking about future generations too much because it's here and now. But in Wales, they have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is beginning to work in terms of making sure that when decisions are being taken, there is a perspective on how does this affect kids and our grandkids and so forth. And I think if we could really build that in to a policy-making process, then we could have some better outcomes and hopefully more of an intergenerational approach.
I'd just like to remind you that there are some older people who are busy fighting very hard on climate change and have been doing it since they were relatively young. So I just wish to say that we're not all in the same box. But the fact is, it is hugely important to mobilise young people. And that's why one of my biggest things to say to all of you is, we lost the vote on the referendum because young people who were in favour of remaining didn't vote. It's a matter of voting. And it doesn't matter, in a sense, what you vote, but you need to be out there and vote. And I do think that's one of the things that we really do need to make this next generation a generation which sees that it must be part of the system if the system is to change. And it's crucially important.
Great, thank you. Can we get a final question? This lady's been waiting very patiently here in the middle for a while.
Thank you. George Short from Sussex Wildlife Trust. I just wanted to comment briefly on the fact that the marine environment is very rarely spoken of in these conversations. Even tonight, it's kind of barely been touched on. Obviously, we're 70% sea on this planet and we're an island nation. So I just wondered what your reflections were on why that's not in the political consciousness and how we could make it so. Thank you.
And I might come back to you in a minute for a sentence about what Sussex Wildlife Trust is doing. But let's just ask the panel just quickly. Anyone wants to build on that? Joe?
Wiltshire doesn't have any sea. Not authorised to comment.
But you have rivers that go into the sea. And,
yeah, we do indeed.
And nutrients. Let's get back to nutrients that go into the sea as well. Yeah.
And I think some of the most compelling images which remind us of how we are mismanaging our soil. There are those images from the air where you can see the soil just billowing out into the estuaries. So you're right, we cannot separate the two. Source to sea.
Can I say kelp? Just because Sussex Wildlife have done such amazing work around regenerating the kelp forests off the Sussex coast, and they've got a wonderful From the Wheel to the Waves programme. So you quite rightly take us up on the fact that we haven't celebrated some really good stuff that's happening out there, but also recognising, as you kind of suggest, that it is massively important and totally integrated with all of the stuff we've been saying so far.
There's a really straightforward point about visibility as well, and how we're not at the seaside every day. We don't see that around us, unless we're very lucky. And also it's about ownership. So for the same reason as it's really difficult to get shipping to change how it behaves, it's really difficult to get change around how the sea is managed because of the multilateral approach to that. So it's kind of combination of out of sight and also complex ownership structures, which means it's much more complicated to do than land management, even though land management is already really complicated to do.
Lord Eden.
Well, I'm a trustee of Blue Marine, and we've already moved the amount of areas now protected enormously in the last few years. One has to say the government has helped enormously, because it has taken all those tiny islands and the confetti of empire and helped them to use their protected 200-mile to turn them increasingly into protected areas. So we've moved from very small amounts of the seas being protected to a much larger, not enough yet, but well on the way to that. And the question of kelp and seagrass, and there's a great deal more work now being done round the coast, will make a huge difference. We could change a great deal by doing one thing, and that is that we should ban bottom trawling. It is utterly unacceptable that we should be cutting up the bottom of the sea, releasing the carbon from it and making it less able to take the carbon in, and at the same time destroying the food chain upon which the fish in the end depend. And why we cannot get it, we had to take them to court. Blue Marine took them to court to get the government even to stop it in marine protected areas. We need to make it illegal, and we need to have an international agreement that bottom trawling is unacceptable anywhere in the world.
Thank you. Please just give us a sentence or two about the amazing work that Sussex Wildlife Trust is doing on kelp off the Sussex coast.
Am I turned off? There we go. Very connected to the sentiments around bottom-towed gear. So we have the UK's largest marine rewilding project in Sussex, with the focus on essential fish habitats and the restoration of kelp. The idea of this is to remove human pressures and let nature lead in its own recovery. We aim then to kind of make an evidence base for how that mechanism will work, and hopefully provide that data set for policymakers to enforce similar bans on bottom-towed gear in other areas of the UK.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions tonight from this audience here at Hogan Lovells in London. And let's just think about how all those issues, the questions we've heard tonight, are linked. We've heard about the clearance of rainforest in South America to make way for soya plantations, and the devastating impact that has on nature, and of course the climate in South America, and the loss of carbon, yes, from the rainforest in South America, but also for the loss of carbon from the soils there. But to grow soya that's then imported here, for example, to the UK and many other places, to then feed in intensive poultry units, to feed chickens in intensive poultry units in catchments like the River Wye, and then having to create those millions, billions of birds, actually chickens, to feed our supermarkets and the demand for cheap meat here in Britain. The result of that is, of course, then an environmental disaster here in the River Wye, with the runoff those nutrients, that pollution into the River Wye catchment, causing a disaster not just in Brazil and not just in South America, but a disaster here in the River Wye catchment as well, leading to that pollution and the death in many cases of the river. And this eutrophication, this nutrient pollution running through the River Wye, that then goes out to the coast, making it much harder for organisations like the Wildlife Trust to try and restore and rewild the coast with seagrasses, for example, which cannot be done if there's too much nutrient pollution in the coastal area, or indeed with kelp as well. Both of those are fantastic natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, but we can't do it if the water is over-polluted. So these issues link up in this extraordinary way, all the way from Brazil right through to the River Wye, associated with our diets back out down our rivers, back out to our coasts, with soils impacted along the way as well. So all these issues are linked between climate and nature through that food chain and through those supply chains there as well. And that we've touched on all of those questions tonight, but it's actually all part of one joined up story. So look, if you've enjoyed this Wildlife tonight, this is the last Wildlife of 2023. You can watch any of our previous Wildlives on the Wildlife Trust YouTube page. We've got a huge back catalogue now of any number of issues that you can watch. You can even watch them speeded up as well if you don't want to watch them at normal speed and just see how funny it is watching me talking at twice speed or whatever. But it's worth doing that. We've had amazing panelists over the last 2-3 years, and it's absolutely worth watching them. I want to take the opportunity to really thank hugely the private donor that's helped pay for all the kit here tonight as well, that has enabled this to happen. And I won't say it who's, but that person's here tonight, so I want to say a huge thank you for sponsoring these Wildlives to enable them to happen, and the travel associated with it as well, so thank you very much for that. We're going to be back in the new year, in the very first week of 2024. We're going to be at the Oxford Farming Conference, in the Oxford Real Farming Conference, with our next Wildlife. That's on the 4th of January, and that's going to be really trying to ask whether it's time to put the so-called food versus nature debate to bed. And we've got a brilliant panel coming together for that. You can get tickets to come in person on that in Oxford for the 4th of January. Just look on the Wildlife Trust website, and obviously also register to watch and take part online as well. I do want to finish, of course, by saying a huge, huge thank you again to our brilliant host tonight, Hogan Lovells, the global law firm, not just for hosting us tonight, but having us as their charity partner for the last 4 years. They've been an absolutely superb supporter of the Wildlife Trust over the last 4 years, and we're very, very grateful to Hogan Lovells for everything they've done. But we also want to finish tonight on the subject of hope, with a hugely exciting video to share from you, because earlier this year, the Wildlife Trusts announced an extraordinary project, a deal with Aviva, the huge insurer. They were supplying us with £40 million to restore temperate rainforests here in the UK. And this was a 100-year contract to do this, a contract which Hogan Lovells helped us at the Wildlife Trust negotiate with Aviva. It was a contract that I signed. You can imagine that's not often you sign a 100-year contract for 40 million quid to restore temperate rainforest. I did it with a nice glass of whiskey as I looked through the fine print. But huge thanks to Hogan Lovells for helping us on that contract. And of course, massive thanks to Aviva for that £40 million donation to make it possible. And we thought we'd finish tonight with this video of hope as to what can be done. Good night.
We're deep in the middle of a genuine climate crisis. I mean, this is an extraordinary period in geological history. We know we're going to get stormier, droughtier, more extreme weather. We're in a nature emergency, 1 in 6 species threatened of extinction in the UK, one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. But we're also in an economic emergency, especially in these rural communities. So we're seeing agricultural payments decline, the subsidies that we give to farmers, and we already know that upland sheep farming in particular is uneconomic. What this project is about saying, can we create a new economic reality for people living and working in this countryside? It's an economic reality based upon the regeneration of nature or the recovery of nature rather than its degradation. The Atlantic Rainforest Restoration Programme is essentially, in concept, a pretty simple project. We're going to acquire about 2,000 hectares of land. We're going to plant trees on that. We're going to look after those trees for hundreds of years, and eventually those trees will turn from a young forest into wonderful, rich Atlantic rainforest that'll be there forever. And as that rainforest starts to grow, it will pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We'll measure that carbon by looking at the number of trees, how thick they are, and we can turn that into carbon units, and we'll give those carbon units to Aviva that can retire them out of the system as part of their journey to net zero.
We knew that we had to reduce our own carbon emissions as a company, but Also, we knew that we couldn't just do that by ourselves. We decided that we would fund £100 million worth of nature-based solutions. So we chose the Wildlife Trust to provide us with some projects that would not only help sequester carbon, but also public access for the local communities, restoration and enhancement of biodiversity, and also a little bit about research and understanding what we've actually lost as a country and how we can help get that back again.
I'm Fabienne Gress, I work at Hogan Lovells and we're a global law firm that specialises in commercial law, and we're really delighted within the UK to have our partnership with the Wildlife Trusts, who for the past 4 years has been our dedicated UK charity partner. It was wonderful to figure out the different elements of pro bono legal advice that we've been able to offer, the Aviva deal which has helped to unlock almost £40 million.
As far as I know, there's never been an arrangement like this where we're using the woodland code to determine the carbon that's going to be generated, the charitable aspect of the trust's activities, the biodiversity. The whole thing is a completely new venture, so obviously it was new ground for us in many ways. I love the outdoors, I love wildlife, I love trees, and it's wonderful to be able to help and use the skills I have from commercial contract work to help an organisation like the Wildlife Trust, which does such wonderful things.
To be a project manager creating a temperate rainforest is not something that you come across very often. So I'm very excited to be working on such a new project, not just to Wales but to the whole of the UK. And I can't wait just to get a hold of the project and get on with it.
When we heard that this fantastic farm was going to be on the market just in the hills here above Clonogfawr, only because of the donation that the Wildlife Trust had received via Aviva, were we even able to think about acquiring that piece of land. It's the chance to re-establish Celtic rainforest that once would have clothed the slopes of Bulchmawr here behind me, to manage a wonderful SSI SAC designated wetland, and to demonstrate beyond that that the future of farming has a place here, and to take that vision out to others.